When we try to think of our true self, our attention turns inwards towards our essential self-conscious being, and thus our mind subsides in the source from which it originated. This subsidence of our mind in the innermost core of our being I am, which is the true form of God, is the state of true and perfect self-surrender. Therefore, though Atma-chintana literally means self-thought or thought of ourself, it is truly not a state of thinking but is simply the state of just being. Whenever Sri Ramana talks about thought of ourself, thinking of ourself, or thinking of I, he is not using the words thought or thinking in a precise sense, but is using them loosely to mean attention or attending. A thought or the act of thinking is actually just the act of paying attention to something. When we attend to anything other than our essential being, our attention takes the form of an action, which we call thinking. But when we attend only to our essential being, our attention remains as being. Therefore, if we try to think of ourself, of our true being or I am, our mind will become motionless. All our thinking will cease, and we will remain in the state of just being. In its strict sense, thinking is the act of forming and experiencing a thought in our mind. Our forming a thought and our experiencing that thought are not two separate actions, because we form a thought by our very act of experiencing or knowing it. As such, thinking is a process of imagination, a process by which we conjure up the experience of images, thoughts, or feelings in our mind. This process of thinking is what gives our mind a seeming identity or separate existence. When we think, we rise as the separate consciousness we call our mind. And when we do not think, this mind of ours subsides and dissolves in its source, which is our essential being or true self. Our mind is the separate and finite consciousness in which we form and experience all our thoughts or imaginations. However, it is not only that in which all thoughts are formed and experienced, but also that by which they are formed and experienced. Moreover, since our mind forms itself by its act of thinking, it is itself a thought, a product of its own imagination. Therefore, since our mind always experiences itself as the I which thinks all other thoughts, Sri Ramana often refers to it as the thought I. In the 5th paragraph of Nanyar, after explaining that this thought I, which seems to rise in our body, actually rises from our heart, the innermost core of our being, and that by attending to this thought I, we can return to that source, Sri Ramana goes on to say, of all the thoughts that appear in our mind, the thought I alone is the first thought. Only after this rises do other thoughts rise. Only after the first person appears do the second and third persons appear. Without the first person, the second and third persons do not exist. In the clause, the thought I alone is the first thought, which is highlighted in bold type in the original Tamil text. The word that I have translated as first is mudal, which has various related meanings such as first, foremost, primary, root, base, basis, origin, and cause, all of which are appropriate in this context. Not only is this basic thought I the first thought to rise and the last to subside, it is also the origin and cause of all other thoughts. Without it, no other thought can rise, because this primal thought I is the thinker that thinks all those other thoughts. Being not only a thought but also the thinker, it is fundamentally different to all our other thoughts, because it is the knowing subject, whereas they are all just known objects. That is, it is the only thought that is endowed with an element of consciousness. It is conscious both of all our other thoughts and of itself as I. However, because it appears to be limited within the confines of a physical body, it is not a pure, uncontaminated form of consciousness, but is a mixture of consciousness and all the limitations of this body that it imagines to be I. When Sri Ramana says, of all the thoughts that appear in our mind, he means every type of thought, including all our verbalized thoughts, our concepts, our beliefs, our memories, our dreams, our feelings, and our perceptions, except our essential consciousness I am. Everything that we know is a thought, an impression, or image that appears in our mind. When describing the dependence of all our other thoughts upon our primal thought I, Sri Ramana refers to the latter as the first person, and the former as the second and third persons. Which of our other thoughts does he refer to as second persons, and which does he refer to as third persons? Our second-person thoughts are all those thoughts that we recognize as existing only in our own mind, and which we therefore feel are most close and intimate to us, whereas our third-person thoughts are all those thoughts that we imagine to be external objects that we perceive through one or more of our five senses. All our other thoughts, that is, both our second-person thoughts and our third-person thoughts, arise in our mind only after the first-person thought I has arisen. In the absence of our first-person thought I, neither our second-person thoughts nor our third-person thoughts can exist, except our essential consciousness I am. Everything that we know depends for its seeming existence upon our mind, our first-person thought I, which is the consciousness that knows them. Our mind, our compound consciousness I am this body, is merely an imagination superimposed upon our real consciousness I am, just like an imaginary snake that is superimposed upon a rope. In the dim light of dusk, when we see a rope lying on the ground, we may imagine it to be a snake. But if we look closely at that imaginary snake, we will see that it is in fact nothing but a rope. Similarly, if we look at the compound consciousness I am this body sufficiently closely and keenly, we will discover that it is in reality nothing but the pure and simple consciousness I am, and that the adjunct, this body, is merely an illusion superimposed upon it by our power of imagination. This illusory body and all the other objects or thoughts known by our mind will continue to appear real so long as we attend to them, just as a dream continues to appear real so long as we experience it. Our power of attention is what gives a seeming reality to the things that we know. The delusion I am this body will therefore be sustained so long as we continue to attend to this body or to any of the objects that we know through the media of its five senses. To disperse this delusion, we must cease attending to any object known by our mind, and must instead turn our attention back on ourself in order to know our underlying consciousness I am. Therefore, in order to experience our real consciousness I am as it is, unlimited and undefiled by identification with any form, we must turn our attention away from all forms, all objective thoughts, feelings, or mental images such as our body and this world, towards the one essential element of our mind, our basic consciousness I am. So long as we continue to cling or attend to any form of objective thought, we can never experience our consciousness I am as it really is. Instead, we will continue to delude ourselves into believing that our mind and everything known by it are real. Can anything known by our mind actually be real? Or rather, can anything that we know through the deceptive medium that we call our mind be real? Except our essential self-consciousness I am. each and everything that we know is only a thought of some form or another. All thoughts are a form of knowledge, and conversely, all knowledge other than our basic consciousness I am is a form of thought. All thoughts are known by us only through the medium of our mind, which is our first thought I. But our essential consciousness I am is known by us directly, not through our mind or any other medium. All the knowledge we have of everything other than I am depends for its seeming reality upon the reality of the mind through which we know it. If our mind is unreal, all things known by it must also be unreal, since they are only thoughts that it has formed within itself. The only thing that appears to be known by our mind yet is nevertheless not dependent upon our mind for its reality is our fundamental consciousness I am, because it is not merely a thought that our mind has formed within itself. Even in the absence of our mind, in thought-free states such as sleep, we experience this basic consciousness I am. Moreover, what our mind actually knows is not consciousness I am as it really is, but is only our consciousness I am obscured by our imagination, I am this body. On waking from sleep, the first thing our mind knows is I am. But as soon as it knows I am, it superimposes upon it this false identification, I am this body. Thus, from its very outset, our mind is a lie, a false mixture of our fundamental consciousness I am with the physical body composed of inconscient matter. When its most basic knowledge, the knowledge it has of itself, is thus a lie or falsehood, how can we trust any other knowledge that our mind may acquire? All that our mind knows is based upon its first knowledge, its wrong knowledge, I am this body, because it always superimposes this false identification, I am this body, upon our pure, original, and fundamental consciousness I am. Our mind can never know our pure, uncontaminated consciousness as it really is. The one essential quality of consciousness is that it is always self-conscious. It always knows its own existence or being, and that consciousness of its own existence is what we call I am. However, in addition to knowing its own existence, consciousness sometimes also seems to know other things. When our consciousness thus knows other things, we call it our mind. The nature of our mind is to know otherness or duality. Our mind is thus a mixed consciousness, a consciousness in which our fundamental knowledge I am is mixed with the knowledge of other things. However, whereas the knowledge of other things is something that appears and disappears, and while appearing constantly undergoes change, our basic knowledge I am does not appear or disappear, but exists permanently and without undergoing any change. Moreover, whereas the knowledge of otherness depends upon our consciousness in order to be known, our basic knowledge I am does not depend upon anything else in order to be known, because it is itself, the consciousness by which all things are known. Thus, in the mixed consciousness that we call our mind, what is real is only our fundamental consciousness I am. This fundamental and uncontaminated consciousness I am seems to become the mixed consciousness called mind only when we superimpose upon it the knowledge of other things. But whereas our basic consciousness I am is permanent and therefore real, all our knowledge of other things is merely a temporary appearance and is therefore unreal. Our consciousness I am alone is real because it alone satisfies all three conditions by which we can judge something to be real. That is, It is permanent, unchanging, and not dependent upon any other thing, either to exist or to be known to exist. Our mind is a temporary form of consciousness that appears and disappears and that constantly undergoes change during the time of its appearance. Though it appears to know its own existence as I am, it actually borrows this knowledge of its own existence from our real consciousness, which underlies it and gives it a seeming existence of its own. Our knowledge I am is experienced by us even in sleep. When our mind has disappeared, but when our mind appears in waking or in dream, it usurps from us this basic knowledge I am, and masquerades as if this knowledge were its own. Our knowledge or consciousness I am is our real self, and hence it is the one thing that we experience always. But our mind is not our real self, because we only experience it temporarily. There is therefore a clear distinction between our knowledge I am and our mind, which merely assumes this knowledge in waking and dream as if it were its own, but is separated from it in sleep. Thus, the seeming union of our mind with our knowledge I am is not a real oneness, but is only a transitory appearance. Therefore, our mind is not independently conscious of its own existence. To know its own existence as I am, it depends entirely upon our real consciousness, without whose support it could not appear to exist. Being impermanent, constantly subject to change, and entirely dependent upon our real consciousness, both for its seeming existence and for its seeming knowledge of its own existence, our mind is not real. Whatever reality it appears to have is only relative and not absolute. That which is only relatively real is not truly real at all, but merely appears to be real. Only that which is absolutely and unconditionally real can be called real in the truest sense of this word. In the previous chapter, we described our mind as our knowing consciousness, because its nature is to be always knowing things that it imagines to be other than itself. Since it rises and subsides or appears and disappears, we can also describe it as our rising consciousness, in contrast to our real consciousness, which is our being consciousness, the consciousness that just is and that never rises to know anything other than itself. Our mind or rising consciousness cannot rise or come into existence without imagining itself to be a distinct and separate entity, and without simultaneously imagining something other than itself to know. It imagines itself to be a separate entity by imagining a physical body, and by simultaneously imagining that imaginary physical body to be itself. Thus, our mind, or rising consciousness, rises by imagining I am this body, and it simultaneously imagines that it knows things other than itself. Without simultaneously imagining both of these things, our mind cannot rise. As soon as we wake up from sleep, we feel as if we have woken up or risen in a particular body, which we feel to be ourself, and we simultaneously feel as if we have become aware of a world around us, which we feel to be other than ourself. This feeling of rising as a body and knowing other things is all an imagination. But so long as we identify ourself with our rising consciousness, it appears to us to be quite real. We are able to know things other than ourself only through the medium of our mind, our limited rising consciousness. Generally, we divide all the objects that we know into two broad categories: our thoughts and the external objects perceived by us. In this context, the term our thoughts includes all the second-person objects known by us, that is, all our thoughts, feelings, and emotions, and everything else that we recognize as existing only in our own mind. The term external objects, on the other hand, includes all the third-person objects known by us, that is, everything that we perceive through any of our five senses, and that we therefore imagine exist outside of and independent of our mind. If we are asked whether we think that our thoughts exist apart from our knowledge of them, most of us would readily admit that they can exist only if we know them. We may think that we are only vaguely aware of some of the thoughts in the background of our mind, but any thought exists only to the extent to which we know it. A thought is essentially just an image in our mind, an object that exists only in our own consciousness, and as such exists only because we know it. However, though we recognize that for their seeming existence our thoughts depend upon our knowledge of them, we imagine that the external objects that we perceive through our five senses somehow exist independent of our knowledge of them. But this distinction that we make between our thoughts and external objects is false. Whatever we know only in our own mind. Even the external objects that we think we perceive outside ourselves are actually experienced by us only as images in our own mind, and therefore they are also thoughts that we form and know by our power of imagination. Except our basic consciousness of our own being, I am. Everything that we know is just a thought that we have formed in our mind. Knowing anything other than ourself is therefore synonymous with thinking. It is a process of imagination, and can happen only when we imaginarily limit our consciousness as something other than the thoughts and objects that we know. Limiting ourselves as a mind, a separate individual form of consciousness, is therefore the fundamental and essential factor in the process of thinking or knowing things other than ourself. Though we usually imagine that our mind rises as soon as we wake up from sleep and does not subside until we again fall into sleep, our mind actually rises and subsides countless times each second. With the rising of each thought, our mind rises to think and know it, and with the subsidence of each thought, our mind momentarily subsides before rising almost instantaneously to think and know some other thought. Thinking is essentially a process of forming and simultaneously knowing thoughts. As we discussed earlier, our forming a thought and our knowing that thought are not actually two separate actions, because we form thoughts only by imagining them, and imagination necessarily involves knowing what we imagine. Since our mind forms its thoughts only by imagining them, and since imagining something essentially involves attending to and knowing a mental image or thought, all thoughts are ultimately formed only by our attention or power of knowing. In other words, our power of imagination, which forms all our thoughts, is just a faculty of our power of knowing or consciousness. Since at any single moment our mind can attend to and know only one thought, it cannot imagine or form more than one thought at the same time. Therefore, as we discussed in the first chapter, our thoughts rise and subside in our consciousness one at a time. Each consecutive thought can rise or be formed only after the previous thought has subsided or dissolved. However, because each individual thought rises and subsides in an infinitely small period of time, during each second a countless number of consecutive thoughts can rise and subside in rapid succession. Therefore, because of the rapidity with which thoughts thus rise and subside, our surface mind is unable to discern the rising and subsiding of each individual thought, and therefore cognizes only the collective impression formed by a series of such individual thoughts. This is similar to our eye being unable to discern each individual spot of light on a television screen, as a result of which it cognizes only the collective impression formed by a series of such spots covering the entire screen in rapid succession. The picture that we see on the screen of a cathode ray tube television is formed by many horizontal lines of light, each of which is formed by many individual spots of light of varying colors and intensity. These individual spots of light, which are known as pixels, the syllable pix, standing for pictures, and EL, standing for element, are formed on the screen one at a time by a ray of electrons discharged from the cathode at the back of the tube. Controlled by the steady sequence of oscillations of the magnetic or electrostatic field through which the ray of electrons is sprayed, in a fraction of a second the entire television screen is covered with a series of pixels of varying colors and intensity, thereby collectively forming a complete picture. Because each individual pixel is formed only momentarily and dissolves almost immediately, within a fraction of a second the oscillating ray of electrons is able to form another pixel of different color and intensity upon the same spot on the screen, and thus, in each successive fraction of a second, it forms a slightly different picture upon the screen. Because the cognitive power of our eyes is not sufficiently subtle and refined for us to be able to perceive distinctly the rapid formation and dissolution of each individual pixel, or even the slightly less rapid formation and dissolution of each entire picture that is formed on the screen by a single sweep of the ray of electrons. What we cognize is not mainly rapidly changing individual spots of light, but only a complete and continuously changing picture. Each individual thought that momentarily rises and subsides in our mind is similar to a pixel that is momentarily formed and dissolved on a television screen. Because each individual thought rises or is formed only momentarily and subsides or dissolves almost immediately within an infinitely small fraction of a second, our mind can form another thought in its place. Because the cognitive power of our mind is usually not sufficiently subtle and refined for us to be able to discern distinctly the extremely rapid formation and dissolution of each individual thought, what we usually cognize is not many rapidly rising and subsiding individual thoughts, but only a single but continuously changing flow of thoughts. However, if we practice being attentive to our infinitely subtle consciousness of being I am, our power of attention or cognition will gradually become more subtle and refined, and eventually we will be able to cognize each individual thought as it rises. When, by the practice of self-attentiveness, our power of attention is thus refined and made sufficiently subtle to be able to detect distinctly the rising or formation of each individual thought, it will also be able to cognize clearly our picture and essential being, which always underlies and supports the formation of our thoughts, and which momentarily remains alone in the gap between the dissolution of one thought and the formation of the next thought. When our power of attention or cognition thus becomes sufficiently refined to enable us to experience clearly our essential consciousness of our own being I am, in the clarity of that pure self-consciousness or self-knowledge, our mind will be dissolved, being a mere apparition that had risen only due to our lack of clear self-knowledge. That is, since our mind is merely a limited form of consciousness that feels, I am this body, It cannot arise or be formed in the bright light of true self-knowledge, which shines only as our adjunct-free and therefore unadulterated self-consciousness I am. And since this illusory feeling, I am this body, is our first and fundamental thought, which is the root or base of all other thoughts, when this feeling is dissolved by our true self-knowledge, no other thought will be able to rise or be formed in our consciousness. As we saw earlier in this chapter, our mind first forms itself as our root thought I, and then only does it form each other thought. Our root thought I is the thinker, the agent who thinks all other thoughts. Therefore, underlying the formation of each individual thought is the formation of our root thought I. No other thought can be formed without our thought I being formed first. That is, we cannot form any other thought without first forming ourselves as the thought I, which is the agent that thinks that thought. However, the obvious corollary of this truth is that we cannot form ourselves as the thinker, or first thought I, without simultaneously thinking or forming some other thought. Without forming some other thought to cling to, we cannot rise as the thinking thought I. The nature of our first thought I is to think other thoughts. And without thinking other thoughts, it cannot appear to be formed as a separate individual consciousness. That is, our essential consciousness of being I am seemingly forms itself into our first thought, I am this body, only by thinking some other thought. Therefore, along with the formation and dissolution of each of our other thoughts, our thought I is formed and dissolved. In other words, the repeated formation and dissolution of our fundamental thought I is part and parcel of the formation and dissolution of each of our other thoughts. Hence, in the brief gap between the dissolution and formation of each two consecutive thoughts, our mind, or root thought I, is itself dissolved and reformed. Thus, this gap between each two thoughts is a miniature sample of sleep, and the rising and subsiding of each thought is a miniature sample of waking or dream. Therefore, our states of waking and dream are a macrocosm of which the formation and dissolution of each one of our individual thoughts is the microcosm. Therefore, if we gradually refine our power of attention or cognition by our persistent practice of self-attentiveness, we will eventually be able to cognize the underlying reality that remains between each successive subsidence and subsequent rising of our mind or root thought I. That underlying reality is our essential self-consciousness, which we always experience as I am. Though we always experience our true self-consciousness I am, at present we do not experience it as it really is, because we are experiencing it mixed with the distorting limitation of our mind. Therefore, we are able to experience it clearly in the momentary mind-free gap that exists between the subsidence of one thought and the rising of the next thought. We will be able to know it as it really is, unadulterated by even the slightest form of duality or otherness. Hence, when we practice self-attentiveness, our aim is to experience our own natural self-consciousness, unadulterated by even the slightest appearance of our mind or any object known by our mind. Instead of experiencing ourself as a body or any other adjunct, we should attempt to experience ourselves clearly as our true adjunct-free self-consciousness I am. The immediate substratum, background, or screen upon which our states of waking and dream and all our individual thoughts within those states are formed and dissolved is the state of sleep, in which we experience only our own essential consciousness of being but in a manner that is somehow not perfectly clear or distinct. However, the ultimate substratum or space, in which not only our waking and dream but also sleep are formed and dissolved in our true state of self-conscious being I am, in which we experience our fundamental and essential consciousness of being in its full, natural, and absolute clarity. Therefore, since the entire universe and the physical space in which it is contained are nothing but thoughts that we have formed in our mind by our own power of imagination, in Advaita Vedanta, it is said that the physical space, or bhutakasa, is contained within the space of our mind, or chidikasha, and that the space of our mind is contained within the space of our true consciousness, or chidikasha. If we can cognize how, within our own consciousness, we form and dissolve our thoughts, we will have understood the secret of how the entire universe is created and destroyed. To attain first-hand and immediate knowledge of this secret, we need not tax our mind pondering over any of the various religious or scientific theories of the origin of the universe, but need only scrutinize our own consciousness, which is the source, from which the space in which all our thoughts and this entire universe arise, momentarily stand, and then again subside. Both Genesis and the Big Bang, which are both believed by certain groups of people to account for the appearance of this universe, occur in our mind every moment with the formation of each one of our thoughts.